Today we're going to look at the beginning of the Canterbury Tales, which is known as the prologue. So the Canterbury Tales by Geoffrey Chaucer are an incredible wealth of information and interesting tales. So let's take a look at how this whole series of things starts. And the Canterbury Tales, the prologue really serves to give us some background information, an introduction to these tales, this group of tales that tells of a pilgrimage. So what we're going to look at today is we're first going to define for you what the Canterbury Tales are, the literary elements that are in the Canterbury Tales, how to watch for them, how to identify them, and then actually look at the verbiage in the prologue and see how that leads us so nicely into this wonderful group of tales. First, let's look at the author. The author is Geoffrey Chaucer, and such a unique individual because he really accomplished a lot in his lifetime, much more so than what would normally be expected at this time. He was the son of a merchant who was really a winemaker as well as a merchant, and so he was in that mercantile or laborer's class. The way he provided for his son, Geoffrey, to move outside of that class, something that really did not happen very often, was that through the course of the Black Plague, he inherited a lot of land and thus a lot of wealth, which allowed him to send his son to become a servant or a page for the king and the queen. And so Geoffrey does this and ends up really being a diplomat, and he serves in the 100 Years' War as a diplomat with many connections, makes different connections to the king, and is often with persons of the noble class and learns to live within that class himself. He learns what it means to be politically correct, if you will, and he learns how to be a part of a class that had never been part of his family. And he also uses this time by visiting other countries and learning from several different authors, which in the end we can see became huge influences in how he wrote and what he wrote. He is really said to be the father of English poetry because of the way he wrote the Canterbury Tales, and that he used the vernacular of the time, and instead of reverting to the Latin or even converting it to French, if you will, at the time where French ruled a lot of the noble or elite classes, he chose to write in the vernacular, the English, and so he really becomes known as the father of English poetry as we know it today. And the Canterbury Tales are a very interesting piece of literature because they are written in the vernacular of the time. Vernacular meaning they were written in the everyday language that was spoken at the time, which was really what we know today as Middle English, somewhere between Old English and what we speak today, which is known as contemporary or modern English. So he's writing somewhere in between there and using vocabulary and phrases and terms that really everybody would understand because it was written as though it was being spoken and as though it was dialogue. So the interesting thing about Canterbury Tales is this new form of literature using the vernacular, not to be held just for the elite or the educated to read, but really available for everybody to read. It really does a wonderful job of describing and explaining the tensions of the time and how things worked and how people survived and the struggles and the crises that occurred as people worked through a new form of government coming in and worked through all the changes that came with feudalism. And it illustrates so nicely for us and defines as well really the functioning of the class or estate system of medieval England. And it shows us how, although Chaucer rose out of his class, that really people survived and stayed in the class they were born in. There wasn't much movement from class to class. There may have been some movement if someone went in to be part of the clergy and went to, become a priest. That was a little bit different. But for the most part, if you were born a laborer or son or daughter of a laborer, you stayed within the labor class. And we also see, with the introduction with William the Conqueror coming in, even a new class added with that of the knights and the warrior class, but still there wasn't much movement. And the Canterbury Tales are wonderful at showing how each of these classes worked, how they thought, what their lives were like, the vocabulary that they used, the way they dressed, the way they conversed amongst themselves. There are several literary elements to the Canterbury Tales that show both how they've grown from the past, but also how they're foreshadowing literature that will come to us in the future. And the first part of it is it is a narrative poem, in that you have a narrator describing the activities, the dialogue, the tales as they are being told, something that was very different. Usually if you had a narrative poem, it was the speaker speaking directly to you. It was not a bunch of characters dialoguing between themselves and then the narrator giving you perspective or aspect on what they're talking about. So Canterbury Tales really came from the influences that Chaucer had been introduced to as he traveled through Italy and France. This is also written in couplets, so that you have couplets with rhyming words, and not an easy feat in a poem of this length or this magnitude, if you want to call it that, in that it encompassed so many characters, so much dialogue. So the use of couplets was a great example of just how talented, gifted, or knowledgeable that Chaucer was. He uses characterization so masterfully in the Canterbury Tales. He really does a wonderful job of showing, not just through dialogue, but his own descriptions of the characters, exactly what class they're from and how they embody all of those things of that class, whether it be of the knights or of the clergy and the distrust that was starting to build with the church, or the laborers still being resentful of the landowners. He shows all of this really spectrum of characters in here, and he uses such wonderfully descriptive vocabulary that we can almost see these characters in our mind's eye as he's talking about them and as they are telling their tales. He uses both indirect and direct characterization, which means if it's a direct characterization, he's talking directly about what this person is and how it works and where he's from. The indirect characterization occurs as this person or character is telling their tale. So as the knight is telling his tale, the characterization occurs by the phrases that the knight will use in telling his tale, or the setting of his tale, or the moral that comes from his tale. All of that adds up to indirect characterization, which proves to further explain the class or estate system that was existing in England at this time. We also use or see Chaucer using what's called a frame story, meaning that he has created a larger picture for us, or a story outside the stories, for reference for us. And the frame story for the Canterbury Tales is that of these 29 pilgrims who have set out from the Tabard Inn on this pilgrimage to go to the Canterbury Cathedral to pay respects and to offer laments and ask for help from the saint of Thomas Becket, and so who is buried there. And so we see this frame story of these people from all these different classes coming together on a pilgrimage, something that probably they would never have associated with each other if they didn't have this common purpose of the pilgrimage. And Chaucer uses this frame story to, one, explain why they're all together, and two, to have a point of reference where they all become connected. Otherwise, these classes, these different people, wouldn't associate with each other. They wouldn't have anything in common. So the frame story is the common thread that he weaves through all of their tales. With the prologue, the setting is interesting because it's spring at the Tabard Inn, and spring he really does very dramatically describe as the rebirth of things, and everything's lovely and the weather's nice, and spring seems to bring on this desire to go on vacation, so they decide to go on a pilgrimage. And so you see this springtime becoming almost a motivator for these people. And it's interesting how Chaucer uses that as part of his setting simply to explain why they're doing what they're doing. And as I said, these 29 pilgrims are on their way to the Cathedral of Canterbury, really to visit the shrine of Thomas Becket. And they're going there as part of a religious pilgrimage to ask for penitence for sins, but also to possibly ask for help or healing for someone that is ill, possibly themselves, possibly a family member. There are several reasons, but pilgrimages had become very commonplace, something that people strive to do as part of their practicing of the Christian faith, of their religious beliefs. There are theories that pilgrimages became somewhat of a pride thing, that they're showing their ability to practice their faith and standing within a community, but really the pilgrimages at this point were to take a person and move them outside their normal life so that they can do some spiritual retroflexion. And so we see some of these pilgrims actually doing this. Some of these pilgrims are literally just going through the motions, and it's interesting how Chaucer separates these two elements of it. We also see this pilgrimage as being really not an easy task. And so it's 55 miles on horseback, which really may not sound like that much, but at the time and over the rough terrain that they were covering, it was not an easy feat, to say the least. And so it was time-consuming, it was arduous, and most of these pilgrims may or may not have done this before, but were not used to having to do this type of traveling. So again, referencing back to the frame story, he uses the pilgrimage to show us those who are willing to go above and beyond to meet what they see as a religious requirement, but also those who are doing it because they've been told to do it, they have to do it, they have no choice, and do it somewhat begrudgingly. And as we look at the setting and as we see them move through this terrain, and again, back to the frame story where they decide that the host tells everybody that you'll tell two tales, everybody will tell two tales on the way to the cathedral, and then everybody will tell two more tales on the way back. And so we see them going through this 110-mile journey, or looking towards this 110-mile journey, and coming back to the idea that all of their tales will be different because they all come from these different classes. The intention of the tales really was to just keep them occupied as they traveled over this terrain. They didn't have music to listen to or anything like that, like we have today. So it was really to keep them all together and to keep them kind of focused and connected as they made this pilgrimage. The host also told them that whoever told the best tale at the end would receive a free meal when they returned back to the tavern Inn, courtesy of his fellow pilgrims, meaning that they would all pay for the best tale. And so that becomes almost a motivator to not only participate, but to also put energy and enthusiasm into the tale that you're going to tell. We also see the setting, the broad range of classes again, and it's interesting how each of these pilgrims accepts the other, when in normal life or in their normal daily routines, that would not have been true. So you see them stepping outside their normal daily lives to accept each other, to help each other, to make this pilgrimage worthwhile, if you will. The characters that Chaucer creates for us are so unique and descriptive. He does a wonderful job of specifically describing each and every one of them so that we can see who this person is just by the vocabulary, the adjectives that he chooses to use. And he's very purposefully including members from all three estates. So that would include nobility of the knights and the warriors. You also see the clergy, which was the monks, the priests, and the nuns that were part of the pilgrims. And finally, you see the laity, which is really the laborers or the merchants, if you will. And so you see all three of these very distinct groups, but yet they're intermingling, which normally they would not do. Also, as part of the characters, you see each tale reflecting who it is that's telling the tale. In other words, if the knight's telling a tale, it's going to include things from his life. the violence, the act of warfare, the act of guarding territory, serving your king, things like that. So you see his tale reflecting who he is, and that's very true of all of these tales. So we see things like the pardoner's tale reflecting aspects from the church, but also reflecting who he is, what he believes, and the deceptiveness of his personality. We also see that quarrels begin to occur simply to show us how these estates differed so drastically and how they really did not get along, and that there were these social and moral differences among these pilgrims. These pilgrims were very different people. They were from opposite ends of the spectrum at times. And so Chaucer does a masterful job, truly masterful job, at showing us that even though they are very different, just as people today are very different, that it's acceptable and it's possible to cross those lines and to become connected and to serve together on something, or to work as a team to accomplish something. And it's interesting that as he tells these tales, granted they were not all finished and some break off in the middle and end in strange places, that Chaucer uses this prologue to not only introduce these characters, to introduce the frame story, but to also show us that he has an objective in telling these tales, and his objective really is to show you what life was like, what these people were like, and although they're so different, that we can learn from all of them. So as you take time and read through these Canterbury Tales, remember that each and every character in here has both distasteful and wonderful traits to them, and that all of them have something to show us and to teach us.